The girl left her grandmother's apartment and went to her home. She had to walk only 100 meters, but on the way she disappeared without a trace. Dozens of volunteers and police were immediately involved, and soon a disturbing discovery was waiting for them. It took more than 30 years to find the truth, and it was one of the most scandalous cases in modern English history. Nikki Allen was born on 30 August 1985 in Sunderland, England. She grew up in a poor family. Her mother, Sharon, had 3 other daughters that she raised alone. This was a very difficult task, and the woman had to work very hard to provide the children with everything they needed. The girls' father rarely saw them, so the woman had to raise them almost alone. In addition to spending a lot of time at work, Sharon also tried to pay as much attention as possible to her children to make sure that they were always full, well-groomed, doing their homework. The woman did her best for the well-being of her daughters against all odds. They lived in a large apartment building located in the central part of the city. Sharon's parents also lived there, helping her look after her granddaughters. Nikki and her sisters often spent time at their grandparents' apartment when their mom was at work. Sometimes, when they weren't home, Sharon would ask her neighbor to look after the children. The house they lived in was very large. Almost all of its residents communicated with each other and maintained good relations. On the evening of October 8, 1992, when Nikki was 7, he and his mother decided to visit their grandparents. Sharon had a headache and she wanted to ask her parents for a pill, and Nikki went with her. Around 9:30, the girl asked to go home as Grandma began to vacuum, and she did not like to sit in this noisy atmosphere. Between their apartments was about 140 meters, and the house was arranged so that Nikki had to go down the stairs to the first floor and walk a short way along the building. For this reason, her mother was not at all worried that something might happen to the girl. After about 10 minutes, Sharon herself went home. When she went to the apartment, to her surprise, she did not see Nikki there. The mother went outside hoping to find her daughter there, but she was nowhere to be found. It was getting dark out there, and Sharon was starting to worry. Nikki was an obedient child and would never leave home without her mother's permission, especially at this late hour. The woman started going around the neighborhood, hoping that one of them had seen her daughter. Several families were immediately involved, but the girl was nowhere to be found. About an hour after the mother found her daughter missing, she decided to go to the police. By that time, many residents of their house were already aware of the situation, and in the shortest possible time, more than 100 people had gone to find Nikki. Together with the policemen, they combed the nearby streets, playgrounds, and the embankment. The officers went around the surrounding houses and tried to find witnesses who might have seen the girl this evening, but nothing came of it. The search continued into the middle of the night and resumed in the early morning. The police department called a press conference to draw the attention of the general public to Nikki's disappearance. However, a few minutes before the conference, the chief of police was told by a sad news report. A group of volunteers searching for the girl noticed the children's shoes and jacket lying next to the abandoned room. People went inside and found Nikki's body in the basement. Medical experts determined that the victim sustained 37 stab wounds, as well as multiple blows with heavy objects, most likely bricks. At the same time, there was no evidence that she was abused. News of Nikki's murder immediately spread among the residents of the district. People were furious and demanded that the monster who did this to the girl be found immediately. The police were under enormous pressure, so they went out of their way to find the culprit. Dozens of officers were knocking on every door, trying to find any useful witnesses. They soon found several people who saw the girl that night. One witness said he spotted Nikki in front of a local bar across the street from her house. According to the witness, it was around 10:00 p.m., which confused the detectives a little. According to the mother, she was to return home and notice her daughter missing at about 8:40. However, this did not go with the witness. However, the police admitted that the woman might have lost track of time, especially due to stress. Since Nikki's disappearance, she has been unable to think of anything else. When the girl's body was found, Sharon was beside herself with grief. It is possible that he and his daughter actually went to the next of kin a little later, and then the witness's testimony came into this chronology. Another woman said that she was sitting in her car near the victim's house just before 10:00 p.m. She saw a little girl walking with a man towards that abandoned building. The police admitted that it could have been the killer, leading them to the logical conclusion that if the girl went with him willingly, she would have known the man. Another woman, who was in an apartment near the abandoned building, heard a loud scream. However, she saw nothing. The police also received a very strange tip. An anonymous witness called them and told them that the night Nikki disappeared, a 14-year-old girl told him how a bloody man approached her and said that he had just killed someone. However, no corroboration of this story could be found, and the detectives did not rule out that the call could have been a simple prank. On the basis of all the data received, the police formed a possible picture of what happened. In their opinion, Nikki did not go to her apartment that night, but decided to stay outside and play. She went to the road behind which the bar was located, and there she was noticed by the criminal. Apparently, he knew the girl. This man could have tricked her into going with him, like by offering her something. The police admitted that his original plan was to abuse the victim. However, when they reached the abandoned building and he tried to do so, Nikki screamed and the attacker was afraid to be caught. Then he hit her with a heavy object and stabbed her, leaving the body in the basement. Soon, the detectives received footage from a street camera near that abandoned building. In these pictures, they saw an adult man walking next to the girl. However, the quality of the image did not allow to see any details. They could not even say with certainty that it was Nike, although this option was the most obvious. Nevertheless, the police sent the footage to the media, hoping that someone would recognize the man. However, there they were going to fail. In total, the detectives received over 100 different leads, and they soon noticed something interesting. Several unrelated people said they suspected the same man, 24-year-old George Heron, of the crime. There were several reasons to suspect him. First, the man moved to the same house where Nikki lived just a few weeks before the murder. He lived there with his sister, did not work anywhere, and had little contact with anyone. Secondly, several witnesses said they saw him in the same bar across the street the night of the murder. According to them, the man ordered potato chips with onion and cheese. From the victim's mother, the detectives learned that these are the kind of chips Nikki loved. But the best part was waiting for the cops to come. They talked to George's sister, who told them that the night of the murder, her brother came home and acted strangely. According to her, he immediately went to the bathroom and spent about half an hour washing his clothes. Detectives got a warrant to search George's apartment. There they found a knife the size of which matched the wounds left on the body. In addition, they confiscated several items of his clothing on which the experts found traces of blood. George was taken for questioning immediately thereafter. At first, the man denied knowing Nikki, but later admitted to seeing her several times and talking to her. The man also insisted that he did not leave the house that night or visit that bar. Despite all the witness testimony, George's interrogation lasted 3 days, and by the end, the detectives had received a much-awaited confession. The man confessed that he saw Nikki outside the bar that night, took her to an abandoned room, and killed her. George was charged with murder and brought to trial. The police had to do their best to protect the criminal from the angry public. Dozens of people tried to break through to George to get back at the scene for what they'd done. People were furious at the atrocities he'd done to that little girl. Initially, the trial was to be held in Sunderland, but it was decided to move it to another city. George hated every single citizen, and everyone knew that finding an unbiased jury would be next to impossible. The trial started almost a year after the murder. Although the trial was moved to another city, many residents of Sunderland arrived at the courthouse. Some of them even tried to attack George when the man was led inside. The country of the prosecution insisted on a male confession. However, there were difficulties. The judge reviewed 12 videotapes of George's interrogation and concluded that the police had used aggressive and illegal methods to extract a confession. They put enormous pressure on the suspect and lied to him about the irrefutable evidence against him. In fact, the detectives had only circumstantial witnesses who had allegedly seen George in that bar, which proved to be highly questionable. People actually said they saw a man who looked like George, but they weren't 100% sure it was him. Moreover, All these witnesses came to the police station, where they were lined up by several men, including George. The police asked them to identify who was at the bar that night, and none of the witnesses identified the suspect. As for the knife and the clothes, everything was very ambiguous. It is not known whether blood was found on George's belongings or whether the detectives invented it to exert pressure during interrogation. The only thing we know is that the judge didn't consider this evidence to be serious, which suggests that the experts didn't actually find any blood there, or that it definitely didn't belong to Nikki. George insisted that after 3 days of almost continuous interrogation, he was so depressed and broken that he would tell the police anything to stop the humiliation. However, he was not provided with a lawyer, and the confession itself also raised questions. The man said he hit the victim with a metal pipe and also strangled her, but there was no evidence of strangulation or blows from a pipe. The criminal struck her with a stone, which was not difficult to prove, but the main turning point in this case was the story of the boyfriend of Sister George. Police documents showed that he testified that George was out of the house for about an hour on the night of the murder, right around the time the girl was attacked. However, at the trial, the man suddenly stated that all this was a complete lie. In fact, he clearly remembered that George was at home that night and they were all watching television together. It turned out that the man initially told the police, but they arrested him for helping cover up the crime and kept him in a cell for 5 days. In the end, he was so scared that he agreed to collect and say that George was leaving the house. It was only after the investigators had obtained the necessary evidence that he was released. As a result, the judge removed 7 of the 12 videotapes of George's interrogation, including the one with the confession. After 6 weeks of intense trial, the jury split and the judge acquitted the man of murder. The decision caused a huge wave of resentment. The people in the courtroom started screaming and threatening to kill George, and Nikki's mother fainted. Nevertheless, the judge's decision was final and all charges were dropped. For obvious reasons, George could not return to the same house as Nikki's relatives. They and all the other tenants were still convinced of his guilt, despite all the inconsistencies. In addition, Sister George was also forced to move. Their fears were not in vain. A few days after the trial ended, unknown men burned down the office of George's lawyer. As a result of the trial, the man was given a new identity and was transported to an unknown destination. The police continued to insist on his guilt, but now they could do nothing because the court found him innocent. If the court found a man innocent, he could not be tried for the same crimes. A year later, Nikki's mother filed a civil suit against George. This court was not as thorough as the criminal court. However, they could not sentence people to prison terms. George, who at the time was living under a new identity, ignored the lawsuit and was eventually fined to $7,000. However, his new name and whereabouts were unknown, so the man did not pay a penny. Nikki's mother never gave up trying to get justice for her daughter. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that some media outlets began to criticize the woman and shift some of the blame onto her. Sharon was accused of not following her daughters, causing Nikki to be out so late. Nevertheless, the mother made every effort to bring George to justice. She regularly wrote letters to the chief of police, various politicians, and even the Queen. The woman hoped that the authorities would review the law on the impossibility of retrial of previously acquitted people, and the police would find further evidence against him. However, all her attempts came to a standstill, and for many years, no progress was made in the Nikki case. 22 years after her death in 2014, the police had a new suspect. They arrested a man who killed 4 boys in the early 90s and served a life sentence in prison. He was accused of killing Nikki. However, in the end, the investigation concluded that it had nothing to do with the crime. In 2017, on the 25th anniversary of her daughter's death, her mother secured another retrial. She hoped that modern DNA technology would help find the killer, and the police department agreed to reopen the investigation. Experts re-examined the clothes. Finally, there was a long-awaited breakthrough. Thanks to State of the art analysis tools, they found DNA traces that were enough to form a profile of an unknown male. Detectives immediately matched it to George's sample. and it didn't match. Immediately afterwards, the police approached the public and called on all the men living next to Nike's family to give their DNA samples. Dozens of people responded to this request, and investigators began searching for all the other men. Given that several decades have passed since then, the process has dragged on for months. In total, they obtained DNA samples from over 800 men. In 2018, they were waiting for a DNA match found on Nicky's clothes. It was a perfect match for David Boyd's. The man, who was 25 years old at the time of Nicky's murder, lived on the same floor as the victim's grandparents, only 3 doors away. Moreover, he was dating a woman who often remained to look after Nicky and her sister. Boyd was never a suspect in this case, even though he lived a few yards from the victim. The reason for this was quite simple. At the time, the police were convinced that George was the real killer. Their opinion did not change even after Boyd was arrested in 1999 for attempting to abuse a minor. The man later confessed to his parole officer that he was constantly having indecent thoughts about underage girls, but that was not all. Turns out he had multiple priors for similar crimes before Nicky was killed. In 1986, he exposed himself to a strange woman, after which he admitted to his psychologist that he had long since lost control of himself. That same year, he was arrested for grabbing a 10-year-old girl and trying to kiss her. You'd think, with this kind of criminal history, he'd be the prime suspect in Nicky's case from day one. However, the police did not even check his background. Boyd was arrested in April 2018, but he denied any involvement in Nicky's murder. The man stated that he was at home at the time. However, a second interview with a witness showed that it was a lie. It turned out that he left the apartment for about an hour. In those years, the police simply did not check his word. The man also failed to provide any coherent explanation as to how his DNA ended up on the victim's clothing. Preparations for the trial dragged on for several years, and the trial did not begin until 2023. Boyd refused to confess and never said a word, leaving all the work to his lawyer. He was trying to prove that the DNA could have gotten on the girl's clothes in a different way. After his arrest, Boyd himself told the police that he might have spit from his balcony when Nicky passed downstairs, which would explain his DNA. The prosecution's position was far more logical. According to them, Boyd spotted a girl walking alone and under some pretext called her to go with him to that abandoned building. Nicky knew him because the man was dating her nanny and trusted him. He tried to abuse her, but the girl screamed and Boyd decided to kill her. It only took the jury 2 hours to unanimously convict Boyd. On 23 May, a judge sentenced him to a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 29 years, which caused a wave of resentment among the Nicky family. Her mum was annoyed at how unprofessional the original investigation was. Due to numerous police omissions, the real killer of her daughter has evaded prosecution for 3 decades, and now the court has granted him early release. However, a chance at release is no guarantee that he will be released. Plus, in 29 years, Boyd will be 84 years old, and there's no guarantee he'll make it. As for George Heron, he gave his first interview only after the real killer was found guilty. The man said that the negligence and unprofessionality of the police had ruined not only his life, but that of his entire family. Despite this, he thanked the new team of detectives for digging into the truth and finding the real culprit. The police department then apologized to him for the first time. They sent a short letter to the man, urging him to move on and not dwell on the past. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and be sure to like it if you liked it. Thanks for watching.